Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you're all having a fantastic Saturday. Today, I am once again joined by writer, co host of the podcast, the New Right podcast, and soon to be a debut novelist, Dan Baltic. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for having me on, Prude. We've been on before, myself and Matt, my co-host on New Right, and it's great to be back here with you, and especially to have the chance to once again talk about literature and fiction in our emerging sphere of the culture, and especially to talk about my novel, Nutcracker.
Well, we'll get into it shortly. So this has just been a continuing series for those listening that, I've had Matt and Dan on before. I've had T.R. Hudson on, Dave Martell, and others. And the point is that we have a lot of conversations online about the need to create things. So that's sort of been my political litmus test as of late. Is that, are you down? Are you working on creating something, or do you find creation to be your anathema? And that's really been the thing I've been focusing on as we talk about the culture, which has been, well, modern literature sucks, modern movies suck, modern art sucks. And well, here through the people I've read, through the people I've interviewed, stuff that I follow and talk to, I want to have our YouTube audience aware of the fact that there is actually good stuff out there and it is being made by our guys. So Dan is just one of many people that I've had on, and many more will be on, so that you guys know that there is good culture and there is good stuff out there. And Dan has a book that is coming out very soon on the 28th, which I had the pleasure to read, and also got to write a little blurb about. So I'm very excited to talk to Dan about this. But before we get into the book itself, I thought that it'd be a good thing to open with, which is sort of the troubling nature of writing political satire in current year. Because I know the guys over at the Babylon Bee, and I just don't know how they keep up with reality.
Yeah, no, that's a real challenge that reality has become stranger than fiction. So how do you satire, you know, events and things that you on their face are just like 10 years ago you would have said, what type of story hour are we talking about here? What's going on in libraries? And yeah, so like it's hard to this gets into to my mind a very kind of fundamental question about satire and what satire means, and that is like you can have a, a satire that is like, well, obviously SNL isn't very good, but like and let's say SNL from the 90s or the 80s when it was funny. You can have a skit or something that just kind of makes fun of something, and it's funny, but it doesn't really grab you the way it's like it's an SNL skit. It's something that you watch and it's funny, but that's not like a deeper satire. That's not the when we talk of like great satirical novels. And so like my novel is in the tradition of A Confederacy of Dunces. Like it's eh, real effective prose novelistic satire is satire that's rooted, to my mind at least, in empathy for the protagonist, for the characters. And so yeah, you it's hard to like it's very tempting to satirize the kind of absurdity of the current progressive moment or whatever we want to call is going on out there. But it's not something like if I wrote a novel that was about like a protagonist who was some, kind of cucked bug man, and he, is woke or whatever, like it wouldn't have been something that I think people would have enjoyed reading for 150, 200 pages. It would be something that is like, oh, that's an okay, like, 10-page or 5-page skit. I'm sick of this guy. I don't want to hear any more about him. The joke's over. Whereas my novel, and I think good satire in general, is something that you have to have. And so, yeah, my protagonist is not woke by any means. He's quite the opposite, and he is a bit of an object of fun for me. I poke fun at him, but ultimately, I think that the reader comes away with, no matter the political predilections of our readers, I think the reader comes away with a sense that I, for better or worse, have empathy for the protagonist of my novel, Spencer Grunhauer. And I think the same would be, certainly obvious if someone read A Confederacy of Dunces. You understand that Toole, John Kennedy Toole, who wrote that novel, has a lot of empathy and sympathy for Ignatius J. Riley, who's the kind of clownish protagonist of Dunces. But nevertheless, in Toole's mind, I'm sure he thought that Ignatius had some good ideas, if not practical ways to implement them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've noticed that from the Passage Prize, where Zero H.P. Lovecraft unfortunately had to judge 1,000,001 satirical horror stories about, it's the soy and everything that kind of, it's funny, but it kind of gets old in the same way that it gets old on Twitter. And I've noticed that his one of my favorite pieces of his is actually making fun of the Green New Deal. The whole idea that you should just give yourself up to the greater good to reduce carbon costs, and he's got
Yeah,
that
yeah,
little bit in there about the ledger of actual carbon cost, which is just a cheesy cute way of saying left accelerationism. And to me, that's the good stuff where I can just notice it and pick up on it, and things that doesn't make the reader feel stupid. And that was one of the things that I really liked about your story, which we'll get into, is that the character is both relatable, and I think that it is an accurate reflection, though, of recent political events that take place, because this takes place right when Trump gets elected.
yeah.
And I don't think anyone's really ran that gambit of telling a story set in that time frame yet from someone who wasn't a raging progressive, because the last 6 years has been nothing but these horror stories about the Orange Man, the allegations of other women that have emerged out of everywhere. And now, there's even these accusations that when he buried his ex-wife in that gold casket or whatever, that, there's actual secret documents in there. They can't get enough of him. But for us, we haven't told, I think, a good story yet on it. And you do. And I wanted to sort of ask you before we really open the book literally on this would be, we do write our own political history. We write our own mythical narratives of parts of politics that we do. I mean, there's a whole grand sort of epic story, for instance, about how Gamergate came to be, right? Like we see all
Yeah.
those memes about like the dominoes falling and like, oh, like Zoe Quinn being immoral with all these, video game review guys, and all of a sudden Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States of America. And we tell ourselves these narratives, and you tell a narrative about, so sort of like the chud, right? Just the and what kind of lengths men will do to be accepted or to be wanted or desired in a political setting. And I thought that was very well done. And my question would be, where do you think that your story lies in here? Are you trying to tell a political narrative, or maybe a history of what we've seen over the last few years, or is this more of a character study?
So I would say all of that, actually. Like, when I set out to write Nutcranker, when I set out to write anything, I don't really have a plan, which sounds kind of crazy. I don't have an objective in mind. I don't have, like, the way I write is I just write until I find a character voice that I like. And so I found Spencer Grunhauer's voice, and he's like, for anyone who should read this, he's a very online, like, we all know the type of person who's a real denizen of the chans, a real kind of like, one of our guys, but very spurgy. Maybe sometimes we see too much of ourselves in such a character, but be that as it may, I wrote until I found this voice, and his story kind of told itself for me. The way I write is I always like to stay maybe two steps ahead of my narrative, but not like I didn't know when I started writing Nutcracker. I didn't know that Spencer was going to go to the Women's March. It's just something that as I'm writing it, I'm like, of course, his progressive. He gets a progressive girlfriend who he's trying to indoctrinate, but it goes horribly wrong. Maybe we'll get more into that later. But she winds up taking him to the Women's March. And it's not something like I didn't set out like I'm going to write a novel that is going to be about political history, is going to be about like what what actually happened at the Women's March, what actually happened, in 2016. But yeah, it went there, and I think the most important thing, if you want to tell any sort of true story about politics, about culture, about life, you have to in my at least in my practice, in my the way I write, you have to start with the character and start with someone who is like in your mind a real person, and you're telling his real story. And so you're not like yes, this is, I suppose, in some respects a right-wing novel. It is like a novel about well, the mainstream had their view of what happened in 2016. What's our view? What's my view? And yeah, this is that. But first and foremost, it's the reason why it's that is because it's an honest, I think, honest telling of this kind of crazy spurgy dude's 2016 and 2017. And he winds up doing all sorts of weird stuff. And it kind of it fiction should naturally kind of interweave itself with the culture and the era in which it's set. And so I had no goals with this until I started writing it. And then like things became like, it became obvious that I would send him to the Women's March. It became obvious that I would send him down a sort of St. Eliot type path, which does not end as many people might expect. This is ultimately more of a comedy.
Yeah, and you had this tweet that you had yesterday that I quite enjoyed, where you said one of your professors said that you don't really get to be a good writer until you've had a real job, one of those sort of like retail or in the real world kind of like shit jobs that really kind of ingrains you with the world, not that sort of office banality. And I was wondering, do you have a 2016 era story that you drew inspiration from your own personal experience?
I mean, well, there's not much that's set in the office in Nutcracker, but there is because he's the main character is unemployed for much of Nutcracker, but he was briefly, and this is part of the plot point. He's employed. He's a man in his mid 20s in Brooklyn, New York City. He's employed at a nonprofit in their media relations department, in their like public affairs department. Just the kind of like the type of job you went to, and throughout the text he's saying one of his common refrains is how proud he is to have went to a highly esteemed liberal arts college. And he's very he's a very arrogant and proud guy, the narrator of the protagonist of Nutcracker. And so he is working, and I feel like many graduates of these types of schools wind up with, if they don't have real skills, in some sort of public affairs role at some company or whatever. So I picked that, and I had him at a nonprofit as a public affairs guy. And I did, have a job, a similar job in my early 20s, mid 20s. I'm a lawyer now, but before I went to law school, this is what I did. And so, yeah, I kind of drew on that experience of office culture when I drafted the scene where Spencer gets he gets fired from his nonprofit job because they discover the treatise that he is writing, which is kind of in
On
some
the
sort of
equitable distribution of wives.
yes, yes, he's he's writing a treatise whereby the state should impose a sort of totalizing eugenic scheme where they pair women with at their 15th birthdays with men of high standing. And this is kind of like an adolescent, spurgy, like, I don't think anyone on our side is proposing something like this, nor should they.
It was
But
like Delicious Tacos met, a 4chan shit poster and just made a long green text about why this is the right thing to do.
yeah, yeah, kind of like if Tacos and Yarvin had a retarded child. That might be that might be Spencer Grunhauer. And yeah, so he he has this this crazy treatise, and they discover it at his nonprofit job, which is of course like a woke leftist organization. And they're like, you're writing about human trafficking and selling young women to the state imposing marriages on young women. And he tries to deny it, but then he gets angry because they're like disparaging his ideas, so he starts defending the ideas, and then he gets fired. And so that's his experience in office culture. That's the extent of Spencer's employment in Nutcracker is that. But I mean, I drew a little bit like not. I do not have a treatise about the equitable distribution of wives. I was not fired from any job actually, but certainly not under these circumstances. But nevertheless, yeah, I guess I drew a little bit from my experience in office life in those chapters. But I think in general, like you just need see right now in literary fiction, and I don't know how familiar our audiences are with the mores of literary fiction today. Hopefully you're not that familiar because it's a very weird and not very good system and culture. But very in vogue is the idea of autofiction, where people are like writing about their own lives, writing about their own, a sort of like it's based on me, but it's not really me. And so, but what it really amounts to is a bunch of people in their 20s in MFA programs writing about their hookups and their lo- lost loves. I'm using quotation marks there for loves, but it's not. It's the type of thing where I think a lot of the writing today does not have grounding in mature perspective. And so I think to bring it back to that quote, I think what my professor meant when he said that you need to work a job you hate before you can write well. I think what he meant is you need to have life experience. You need to have perspective. You need to understand like these auto fiction stories about like, oh, this great hookup that I had, and I was in love for 2 weeks, and then she left me for a poet or whatever. Like it's if you had additional perspective, if you had maybe worked a real job, which like working a real job just implies so much. It implies that you've dealt with kind of crazy clients, you've dealt with like kind of real expectations and accountability, and that also kind of puts the rest of your social life into focus and perspective. So I feel like the same way, not the same way, I don't know, I was going to say the same way having kids puts your life into I don't have children yet, though I hope to. um, but it the experience of like real work, it I think imposes a perspective on your writing that will carry over, even if you're writing about kind of ephemeral stuff like some ill-fated romance or ill-fated hookup. Like you will bring to that a perspective that is realistic, that is grounded in um, a mature understanding of human relations. And ultimately, if you want to write anything that's funny, if you want to write anything that's humorous, you have to. That's where you have to be. You have to like. You have to have already lived, because like humor is something that relies upon, in my experience, as sort of, you have to believe that the narrator has more knowledge than you do, that the narrator has, or at the very least, that you and the author rather are in cahoots in a certain sense. You both have greater understanding than the characters do in the novel. And so in order to write that way, you actually kind of have to do have some maturity, some understanding of the way life works. And what better way to understand it than to work a shit job? And like there are many shit jobs. I wouldn't say it's entirely like blue collar stuff. Like there's an office shit job is an office shit job. And like I'll even say, like, I'm a lawyer. That's a shit job. Like it's like there's nobility in it, I
I see you tweet
suppose.
all the time about dealing with other associates. It's pretty entertaining.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like to bring that because, like, it is funny. Like, it's there's a lot of like everyday life that, like, if I could bring people into my world and I have specialized knowledge of, what it means to be a lawyer, what it means to work in an office. Like, yeah, that's I I capitalize on that, and tell jokes about that. And like, yeah, like regardless of whether you are standing behind the counter at Dwayne Reed. That's a chain that's in New York City. I'm in New York. I assume it's national. I don't know, but like standing behind the counter at some drugstore, or whether you're like sitting in an office drafting agreements, like fielding angry emails from clients and bosses, like you understand accountability. You understand that, like, I have to sit here and take this so I can make money and bring it home, pay my rent, take my girl to dinner. And God, if you have a family, like that's even harder, or even more. It gives you even more inspiration. Like,
Yeah.
this is a bit of a digression, but I remember I was having lunch with a partner from my old firm. I was not very junior then. I was an associate at my old firm, more senior now. But I took him out to lunch, as you sometimes do when a new partner joins the firm. You want to ingratiate yourself to him. You want to, kind of create a good relationship. So I took him out to lunch, and he said something to the effect of, like, he knew that I'd like to write, and he said something like, "Yeah, I used to be a magician. I used to like I'd make money going to parties and playing magic tricks, but like now I have kids, and so like as much as this being a lawyer sucks and is boring, I just think like every day that I'm doing this stupid stuff, like, well, I got to take care of them. I got to make sure that they have what they need." And so that's my new job. Like, my new job is not to have fun. My new job is not to be a magician. Like, I can't imagine this guy as a magician, but whatever. He said he was. My new job is to take care of my children. And I think any sort of job you have that is a real job, and you have real, people don't work real jobs unless they have real responsibilities that they need to take care of. Like, if I didn't have to pay my bills every month, which are substantial, between, various debts and obligations that I've incurred, I don't know that I'd be sitting in an office, drafting agreements for 10 or 12 hours a day. I'd probably, frankly, I'd rather be writing. I'd rather be, writing articles and, working on my next novel. But it is good. It is helpful for me that I am doing that. It's in a weird, ironic, and almost counterintuitive way. My experience in the real world, having responsibilities, having to answer to many people and give orders to many people, it enables me to actually have a perspective that is helpful when I'm writing, because I don't have to wonder. I don't have to wonder, like, well, how would my character feel if he's, has to fire someone, or how would my character feel if he has to, get yelled at? Like, you know, you know, and that I think that's to make a long story, to bring it back to the original quote. I think that's what my professor meant when he said, you have to work a job you hate before you can write. He means you have to acquire the life experience and maturity needed to write um, honest fiction.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen that from a lot of the up and coming writers and novelists in these spaces, is either out of a genuine passion for a genre or a craft that has been long dead. You definitely saw this when we talked to Dave Martell the other week about, the Biz archives and bringing back pulp and fantasy the way that it should be in that Conan, the barbarian style versus today. You do
Oh
have to
yeah.
have an experience or a passion for it. But you had mentioned something there about accountability, and I feel like accountability is a big part of your novel. And there was a part of, to give people a taste of what I mean by this guy needs accountability. I'm going to read just a short passage from the very beginning, so you guys kind of know what Spencer is like as a character. Um, so I'll just read this real quick. Quote, Spencer had a long time stopped trying to guide the conversation to more weighty topics such as the Taliban's increasing foothold in Pakistan or the wisdom of the so-called Troubled Asset Relief Program. Ignominious history was being written before their very eyes, but all Alex, Jason, and Nicole cared about was the prosaic sporting events and blasted reality television. They were busily discussing the merits of a program that revolved around a dating competition on a desert island, a sort of Lord of the Flies for the Bravo set. It was all predictably blasé. But admittedly, it was curious that young roughnecks such as Alex and Jason would consume such effete media. Perhaps despite an outward appearance, Alex was a homosexual, one of those muscular guys who emulated the behavior of normal men. This would complicate Spencer's plans to employ Alex as his prize to lieutenant. That's the kind of guy we're dealing with at the beginning of the book here. Definitely someone that reminds me of those. I'm enlightened by my own because I read the Wall Street Journal, and it gives me that vibe. Very, and this is why I was like, oh, when I'm reading this, I'm like, oh hell, this like kind of stung because I was like, oh, I can kind of see like 18-year-old me in college thinking about the things that I wanted to talk about. I was like a debate kid in high school, and I did it in college, and I was like, yeah, why aren't we talking about these things? But no, it's the social mores of the day to talk about everything else. And I was just like, but that's the character that we're dealing with, is a guy who has a plan, this sort of his own political machinations to have his own project, if we can say.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Spencer is, but the way I wrote him is, I hope that, people read him and they don't fully identify with him. They're not like, oh, I want to be just like Spencer. That I don't think there's anyone who read this novel or will read it who will think that. But I hope that there are many who are like, yeah, in that moment in college, I wanted to talk about something besides The Bachelor, but everyone else was, kind of stupid, and you feel a sort of empathy, I would think or hope, for Spencer in that moment. And of course, he goes on to like undercut the empathy by being like a real spurg and a real like
And a
weirdo,
total
and
bastard.
yeah, and a total bastard in many respects. But like he brings up like decent points. Like if he like the humor here is like there's no reason for him to think that these guys are gay. He's just like, in his mind, like, well, what? I mean, I guess like if I don't watch The Bachelor, like that is kind of gay, but like he doesn't really like it's not warranted, but like in his mind he's like, I wonder if he is, and if so, would I employ such a man? And like I don't want to say anything that is improper for YouTube, but I if I myself were employing people, Yeah, who knows? Maybe such things would be considerations.
So I have to ask because someone else had asked in the chat here. How much of an influence, if at all, did Richard Spencer play, and either naming or just an influence on the character?
Honestly, and I get this a lot, as you might imagine, not
Oh
at
yeah.
all. I started out, writing this, and I'm like, well, I found a voice that is like really kind of like prissy, but also like he has ideas that are like really spurvy and weird. So I wanted a name that was both like you know, kind of feminine, prissy, but like kind of like ugly. So I chose Spencer, which is, I think by all accounts like a very kind of like fancy boy name. And Grunhauer, his last name, which is I was just like, well, what's like a really like guttural, like kind of, tough, or if not tough, but kind of ugly sounding name. And so Grunhauer was the last name I settled on. Spencer was the first. And so as I started writing it, I realized, of course, yeah, there are perhaps many parallels to Richard Spencer, but that was not actually intended. Like, in fact, a girl that I knew at the time and was sharing some of the story with, she was like, she knew a Spencer, and so she was like, "Is this based on the Spencer I know?" And I'm like, "No, I but maybe I don't know. Like, is he a really like weird, pussy?" I don't. I'm sorry again. Like, I should, if there are words I should not be using,
Oh no,
I
you're
will.
you're totally fine.
Okay.
I just it felt like that throughout there because I had that in the back of my mind when you had asked me to read and write the blurb for it. I was just like, oh man, this is got a mix of that sort of cringe, socially awkward, online political guy, that reads articles and likes to feel like he can have intelligent conversation, like the type of 12-year-old that feels like he has better conversations with adults than he does kids his own age. But at the same
Exactly.
time, just watching where this plot takes him politically as well as his own like frustrated ideals and the women that he's around, I was just like, oh, this has got a Richard Spencer vibe to it. So it's good to have that cleared out for the audience because I almost wanted to write in my own blurb that this has got someone had taken Richard Spencer as a inspiration. But we've talked in
Indeed.
and out about the character, but if you want to give our audience a sort of general plot overview of what Nutcranker is as a story, then by all means.
Okay, sure. So, Nutcracker, I've described it as being in the tradition and almost like in some respects a modern day version of a confederacy of dunces. And if you've read or have heard of dunces, it's kind of the travails of this man, Ignatius J. Riley, who's a monarchist and a kind of like steeped in medieval Christianity, and he's trying to navigate then contemporary. This was written in the 60s, New Orleans. And I didn't really set out to write a follow up to this. In fact, Ignatius J. Riley was not on my mind at all when I was writing. It was only in retrospect that I picked up Dunces, and I'm like, oh shit, this is like actually maybe it burrowed into my unconscious. But Spencer has a lot of similarities to Ignatius. And so Spencer is someone who he is living in New York City in 2016, and he is, a bit of an edge lord, a bit of a like a creature of the chans. He's posting on something that is like 4chan. It's not called that in the novel, but it's essentially that. And he is writing a treatise, which is a critique of modernity, and that's his big thing. And he eventually gets fired from his nonprofit job for the reasons I mentioned. They discover his treatise and they find it troubling and misogynistic, and then perhaps it certainly is troubling in some respects. And so he gets fired, and he finds himself adrift, and he winds up striking up a relationship with a girl named Crystal Clancy, who is an SJW type, and he meets her on a BDSM networking site, at which he's like exploring for like philosophical purposes, he says, or something like that. And
Oh
so
yeah,
he
he's definitely watching porn for the plot.
he's a pretty horny fellow, this Spencer. So he meets up with Crystal, and he hopes to he conceives of his budding or potential relationship with her as an extension of his treatise, a real life version of it, where he is going to indoctrinate her in patriarchy by through erotic instruction. And so, like, I don't know, and I'm not going to go into it in great depth, but in the BDSM stuff, like the women often like to submit to male authority in an erotic manner. And so Spencer kind of saw this as an opportunity to kind of like impose his philosophy through sex with this girl. And what happens though is he forms like a real relationship with her, and they start dating. And he winds up, as you might expect, he intends to subvert her progressivism, subvert her wokeism, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't work. In fact, she eventually discovers, she takes him to the Women's March. That's a disaster, as you might imagine. He gets into all sorts of altercations and trouble there. And eventually they break up when she discovers the treatise. And she discovers, that in fact he is very right wing. And more to the point, he's been writing about their relationship and referring to her as such kind of affectionate names as the piglet and other kind of terms in his mind that were affectionate, but which he probably rightly views as insulting or offensive. So she breaks up with him, and he tries to get her back. She winds up dating some Latinx woke guy, and that sends Spencer down a bit of a spiral. And I don't want to get into the ending too much because I don't want to spoil anything. But he, in the foreword, Gio Panichetti, who wrote the foreword, he brings this up. Spencer goes kind of somewhat down the path of quote unquote Saint Eliot, and but it does not end in a way that you might imagine, given that kind of path that it seems to be pursuing. The novel has a twist ending, an unexpected ending, which many people have said is, in a weird way, perversely satisfying.
Yeah, it does have a really good ending in part because it does leave you wondering whether or not everything he's done has endured really a change in him. It doesn't end in any sort of in any sort of typical violent way. In fact, it leaves you actually wondering, well, what's the next phase of this? And I think that itself makes for pretty good political satire because you don't know whether or not his beliefs have changed in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah,
Especially the final line. But this, you all will get a chance to read it. It will be on Terror House Press on the 28th of this month. So,
that's right.
yeah, Geo wrote the foreword. Myself, T.R. Hudson, and one other person had written some blurbs for it. It's a very good book in that regard. And otherwise, I wouldn't have Dan on here to talk about it. But that's sort of
Well,
how it works for me. Is I got to
thank you
read
for it.
and buy the good stuff to let you know that the good stuff's out there. But the thing that I liked about this story is not only because I think that the readers might be able to see a little bit of themselves or a little bit of someone that they might know, but it also covers like, very recent political memory. And I think that this is a book that, you may not have gone out of your way to talk about the political history of it, but it gives sort of I don't want to say it's like, like you mentioned, it's not like an auto ethnographic work, right? Like you're not writing about yourself. Like Spencer Grunhauer is not Dan Baltic, but you write about a guy that I think anyone who's been on, say, the Chans, or has been on Twitter, or has been in like right leaning online spaces has probably known somebody like this,
Yeah.
or maybe see a little bit of themselves in from a former time and maybe cringe. But I think of this as maybe one of the first books that's been written from someone who isn't like a total shitlib, that kind of covers this era of politics. Like, I haven't seen a lot of short stories, I haven't seen any books that sort of talk about frog Twitter, or people posting on their respective like Chans or their Mongolian basket weaving forums. And I think that this is a really good start, even if you didn't go out of your way to talk about it like, oh yeah, I'm going to document, how, I'm going to document through a fictional character like Richard Spencer or whatever. But you do document something that I think a lot of us are looking at in the past, because I think everyone can remember where they were in 2016 when the election happened. It's just I think it's up there for one of those like political moments where, for instance, like I was in Philadelphia, I was at a conference, and it was me and my professor who, he was wearing his Bill Clinton for First Lady t-shirt, and we were watching the results, and Wolf Blitzer had said that Donald Trump will be the 45th president of the United States. And I watched this, 30-something-year-old millennial who's got a PhD just like light up a cigarette, call his boyfriend, and cries at the front steps of the hotel that we're at. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm never going to forget that moment, or forget the city of Philadelphia burning down because Pennsylvania went red in 2016. And so me reading this book was just like, oh yeah, all these things that did happen, and all these sort of encounters that people do go through, because the overly online does have the kind of feeling of, oh yeah, it's so easy to fall down the rabbit hole, like with Spencer Grunhauer, like falling down this sort of FetLife alternative website for trying to understand how to red pill women in the bedroom. It's just a very humorous, like, someone's probably thought of that before, and it has a realism to it that's just pretty damn funny.
Well, thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, like, I think for any political fiction, you need some distance from it to really write it well. So, like, how could you write a novel that it features the Woman's March without like actually being a couple of years away from it, so we know kind of how that played out? Like, I knew, like, I wrote this before 2020, the 2020 election actually. So like I didn't know exactly where we are today. But like I did know that the Women's March launched a sort of years long campaign to depose the president. And and I didn't, at the time I didn't know it would potentially have been a hypothetically successful campaign for such a thing. Um, but I did have perspective. I did know that like this was like actually like, if like I wrote this the next week, like, yeah, I might not really have known that the Women's March would be something that people would remember, that people would talk about. But it still is. And I guess it should be, because like, all these people came out for this like unprecedented march against the president after he's elected, which it this is all to say that it is helpful to have some distance from historical events to write about them. So, like, I think the best, I mean, it's very interesting to see articles that analyze current events as they're happening. Like, for instance, after the 2020 election, I really enjoyed Yarvin's article about just kind of like the chicanery that was going on. And he compared it to, it was his Vivictus article. And I thought that was very incisive. That was but good fiction, good articles can analyze current events, and kind of, I mean, like, but a sort of good, not just fiction, but even like intellectual history, it needs time to marinate. It needs time to kind of, for the author to understand the import of that event, what that time in America meant. And so by the time I was writing this, I wrote it during the height of COVID, when my particular industry was significantly disrupted by COVID. Not the legal industry as such, but more the industry that I practice in within the legal industry. And as a result, I had a lot of free time, and so this was kind of a meditation on on Spencer, but on his relationship to the era of 2016, written in 2020. And I think you do need that lead time. You need a few years. Like I think right now, maybe people could start to write about the election, but I don't think there would have been much good election related fiction in November of 2020, or even January of 2021. You um you need time and distance to deliver something that's sophisticated and you know and also doesn't like quickly become dated, because like the perspective that you will have right after an event occurs, other things are going to happen that make that a perspective that is just then like very rooted in not the current era but the time in which you wrote it. And so I think generally people want to read something that is not rooted in I mean, like sometimes like you will want to read stuff that's a slice of history and it gives you a window into the past, but something that comes out today, like that is supposed to be somewhat kind of like contemporary. You want to have a sense that it's congruent with the current moment. And I think that Nutcracker definitely is a novel of the current moment.
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean about wanting some distance or some time before you write about it. I Not too long ago, I recently went to a closing bookstore and I sort of like, and they were having, they're like, well, it's our last few days open. Just we need you to like empty out the inventory. And so the books were free. And I went through like the current events and political section. And there were I just had this like blast from the past of like George W. Bush era leftism where like Maureen Dowd wrote that book Bush World, and it was all written in like right around 2001, 2002, like as the administration was just starting. So you know that they were writing this even previously before they had it published, because that's really how these political books start. And I was just flipping through it and skimming it, and I was just like, well, this was written, of course, like before Katrina or before things really got bad with the economy, or even before like the war really took a different turn in terms of popularity. And I was just thinking to myself, like what a dated piece of history that this is, sort of those like political hit job pieces that you see all the time in the New York Times, or even the books that happened with Trump, like John Bolton's The Room Where It Happened. And I think that that's a very good point, that if you want to write something that's really well done, I think you need to give it some time, or you need to approach it from a perspective that is incredibly bombastic. I think that good satire or good political fiction comes at it from two forms. One where it's grounded in realism, where you can kind of relate to it and see how it bites because you can relate to it. Or the second one is really sort of this bombastic, futuristic, or fantasy world where you can kind of see the parallels and similarities, but it's not something that you can intrinsically yet relate to. Because, like, for instance, like this one, if like your book feels very grounded, but if I were to read, like I mentioned earlier, Zero HP Lovecraft's Green New Deal, he's picturing this sort of like Soylent Green anti-hero booths for the sake of the environment, where I'm like, well, that's pretty funny and it's pretty out there, but it parallels to sort of this um death ideology that comes out of like climate eschatology from the left. And I think you need a good dose of both in these spheres, and I think we do have it. But this book for me was just like finally the first sort of like grounded take on the overly online, the internet chauvinist meets the real world, and what comes out of that, the ups and downs of radicalization.
Well, thank you, Pruitt. Yeah. I think the best humor, at least for my money, for my mind, is when you have a character and you've created this guy, woman, whatever, who people believe is real. Like you're following this guy, and you're like, okay, he's not a part of a skit. He's not, some cardboard character. He's 3D. He's a person. And you put him in crazy situations because to see someone who you believe, and for all intents and purposes, though he's not in the real world, he is like a rounded and real character. And to see like pressures put upon him and how he responds, like that to me, I mean, like obviously The Office is a bit of a cuck show, as is most Hollywood stuff. But I thought it was very funny, and I liked a lot of The Office. And the reason why, to me at least, it's funny is like I believe that Michael Scott was a real character. I believe that he was a real guy. And so he goes out there and starts like doing like crazy stuff. And like you, the collision, and Nutcracker relies upon this extensively. The collision of the kind of like deranged expectations of one character with the more realistic expectations of the world. Like therein lies, to my mind, a lot of humor, a lot of what is very funny, and also this is heightened by the fact that the real world is itself deranged these days. So like you have in Nutcracker, you have a character like Spencer Grunhauer, who has a spurgy worldview. I mean, not entirely something that I would disagree with in some respects. I'm a bit of a traditionalist, but he has some twists and turns on his ideas that are a little weird. So, but you have this guy with this developed worldview, which is in some respects sympathetic, in some respects extreme or weird, and you put him in a world that is itself. The world believes itself to be normal. Like the office that he's in, at the nonprofit, they believe that they're like, oh yeah, this is normal. But I think probably like you and I and many of your listeners are on the same page that a lot of the current mores in society are not normal, and they don't understand that. So when you have the collision between a character who is himself a bit wacky and has like crazy ideas with a society that has crazy ideas and doesn't know those ideas are crazy, like women going to work, for instance. No. Well, I'll just leave that out there. It creates a sort of a real explosion of comedy, I think.
Well, you had mentioned The Office, and I was going to ask what were some of your chief bits of inspiration, since we know this wasn't, you weren't thinking of Richard Spencer when you wrote this, but while you were writing this during, the COVID stuff and things were definitely a lot more locked down. What were your influences, or both literary, movies, TV? What played a role in helping you write this book?
Okay, so when I was writing it, I did not. I don't think I directly drew from Dunce's, but clearly it burrowed in my mind because from a thematic and even stylistic level, there are clear parallels to A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, and yeah, so that was clearly one of the inspirations. But also, I enjoy satire more generally. So I enjoy one of my favorite novels is Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis, which is a sort of campus culture satire written in, I believe, the '60s about the '50s. So it's a very kind of like vintage look at campus culture. But yeah, so that I like Sam Lipsyte. He I mean, like many mainstream writers, he's of contemporary writers. He's a bit liberal, but what are you gonna do? He's written some very funny novels. Homeland is a great novel, and so his style of humor is something that I think I was influenced by. I was influenced by Welbeck. I like Welbeck. He's he kind of has his finger on the culture. He has his finger on the kind of like problems men are facing today more, and thus that society are facing today. I also let's see. Um, I mean, I mentioned The Office, like that is a style of humor I like. I mean, unfortunately, there's not like a lot that I love on television these days in terms of like stuff that I think is funny. But I like Sam Hyde. He's funny. I like I like Nick Mullen, like Come Town. I mean, it gets a little old after a while, their banter, but yeah, Nick is pretty funny. And yeah, I can't leave out my kind of literary forebears on the E-Right. So Delicious Tacos, Mike Ma, I mean, Zero HP himself, many others. I mean, Bap doesn't write fiction, but yeah, certainly a bit of inspiration there.
And so, it's always good to know where people are coming from when they're writing, especially to see their influences. And we're surrounded now these days by this, like we had talked about the last time you and Matt were on, was just this like up and coming, and I would say rather self-sustaining ecosystem of writers. And I think what you guys do with your own podcast to give light to these artists is a pretty good sign that you're able to point people in the right direction and say, hey, there's actually good stuff out there, whether even if it's not what you expect. Because I think the big question that everyone asks is like, well, can the right make art? And I think that the good response has always been like, yes, and it doesn't always have to be explicitly political. It doesn't have to be like you shouldn't be hit over the head that things are right wing. I mean, the C.S. Lewis kind of hits it over the head sometimes in the Chronicles of Narnia. They're like, oh yeah, Aslan is supposed to be Jesus, but I think that it's a good sign that humorous work, good art are being created that aren't an explicit message because they stand on their own merits. They don't need to be sort of soy jacked over by blue checks or by the corporate press. And that's the thing that I kind of get excited about with this ecosystem is to know that, how bad things are fundamentally are when we talk about the establishment, especially in like the media or literary circles. But it's a thriving and growing environment there. But one of the other last bits of questions I did want to ask was, were there any parts in the story where you just had a really tough time writing or relating to? I don't, like I said, I don't think that you took too much of your own experiences because I think you're a little more set off than Spencer Grunhauer is. But was there a part when you were writing this that really kind of gave you pause and maybe you had to talk to somebody or ask, hey, what was this like?
Hmm. Like, not entirely. I did not really consult with anyone for writing this, except for like people who read for style or whether they liked it. I had a couple of readers, but it more just kind of it's a creative act. Like you get in the mind of a character, and then just suddenly you kind of like I would find myself writing from the perspective of this guy, and like yes, he is in my head. Yes, I've created him, but there is a real, and this sounds perhaps almost feminine, but there is a sense that you are a vessel for this other voice. And and it was helpful that I was able, because of the downturn during COVID at work, to spend hours every day writing this. And so I never really left his head, and I was able to maintain his voice. And so, yeah, I mean, like, this is not, as they say in the writing circles today, this is not auto fiction. This did not happen. This is not me. But like, yeah, this did come out of my mind. This is like, I I am a 36-year-old man. I do have some experience with women and progressive women and what have you. So I've injected some of my own opinions and perhaps even to some extent experiences here. But this is no autobiography. Let me tell you.
Well, it's always good to know, right? Because I don't think anyone, like we said earlier, no one should be Spencer Grunhauer. Although I think once people get a chance to read this, they'll definitely see that opportunity to view a little bit of themselves in Spencer. I think that anyone who's been online for a length of period of time on the right will probably see a little bit of themselves in this character. But Dan, is when do you want to? Where can we find this book? When is it coming out? Who is publishing this wonderful work?
So this will be published. Nutcracker will be published by Terror House Press. The current release date is October 28th. It should be available for order by then. I will be. It is not available for pre-order, but if you follow me on Twitter, Baltic_Dan is my handle. My avatar is a Shiba Inu wearing a Doge cap, Doge of Italy, and you can't miss me. And I will be shilling this all over the timeline. You can buy it from Terror House Press, both in printed form and in ebook form. It's going to have a awesome cover by Matt Lawrence, who does Delicious Tacos as covers, and it should be something that frankly, will look very good on your bookshelf. So yeah, please read it. Please pick it up. We appreciate your support.
Yeah, and when this stream ends, I will have the description updated so you can follow Dan on Twitter along with a link to Terror House Press so you can see not only Dan's book, but also their other great library of texts that are available. They've got some pretty good stuff that I've purchased as well. So yeah, by all means, be sure to stay tuned because it will be out very soon, hopefully by the end of this month. It is a pretty darn good book. I'm very glad that I got a chance to read it early. I'm very thankful that Dan considered me to help write a blurb. We have good writers out there, believe it or not. Everyone likes to puff smoke up their own rear ends, but this is a big reason why I have writers and guys that have their own publications out and available because I think it's really important for us to know. If you're on Twitter, it's a whole different, sphere, it's a whole different space. And then for YouTube, it's a whole different audience. I've learned that pretty quickly that your audiences don't cross over as much. But you guys need to know that, hey, people are making things, people are making culture, and fiction that is actually worth your time to read. That isn't the tripe formulaic stuff that you would see walking into a Barnes and Noble, which at this point is just selling more Funko Pop stuff than it really is good books. So this stuff is out here. And Dan, now that you have finished this great work, what are you up to now?
So I am writing a short story, which hopefully will come out soon. Maybe on Terror House, they have a magazine, an online magazine. It might come out with them. And I'm starting to work on a follow up to NUTCRANKR, and I'm not entirely sure what form it will take, but it will certainly be excerpted on a Substack that I'm planning to start to contain. I consider myself a bit of a Twitter author. I take a lot of pride in my tweets, but I want to start getting more of my fiction out there. So there will be a short story coming out soon. It's about one of those TikTok character women who kind of do crazy deranged TikToks, and it should be a fun one. So keep your eyes peeled. It might come out with Terror House. It might come out on my Substack, but there's a second novel in the works. And please follow New Right, the podcast New Right, which I co-host with Matt Pegas, and we have writers on every week and talk about the state of the creative the creative sector of the right, which is growing and getting bigger and stronger every day.
Well, I will have all of these links down below in the description as soon as this ends. But, gentlemen, thank you all so much for tuning in. I think that you're going to really enjoy this book when it drops with Terror House Press. The guys over at the New Right are exclusively providing us great interviews, but also illustrating the fantastic environment there is for literary nonfiction as well as media, art, all kinds of stuff out there. What Matt and Dan do is far better than my one-on-one interviews can, because these guys do this stuff full time. And very thankful for what they put out, because that means you guys get to know that there is good culture, there is good fiction, and most importantly, it's being made right now. So thank you so much, Dan, for coming on. Your book, Nutcracker, drops on the 28th of October on Terror House Press. So be sure to head on over to terrorhousepress.com and stay tuned, because this book is going to come out very soon. And with that, Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, Prude. It is a pleasure and an honor.
All right. Well, ladies and gents, I will see you all next Saturday when we return back to geopolitics and international relations with the new show, The Prudent Observations, to continue on from the Sunday stream. And with that, see you all next time. Take care.